Herndon became a Communist Party organizer in Atlanta. He and his fellow communists organized block committees of unemployment councils in 1932, which got rent relief for needy people. They organized a demonstration to which 1,000 people came, 600 of them white, and the next day the city voted $6,000 in relief to the jobless. But soon after that, Herndon was arrested, held incommunicado, and charged with violating a Georgia statute against insurrection. He recalled his trial. The state of Georgia displayed the literature that had been taken from my room and read passages of it to the jury. They questioned me in great detail. Did I believe that the bosses in government ought to pay insurance to unemployed workers? That Negroes should have complete equality with white people? Did I believe in the demand for the self-determination of the Black Belt? That the Negro people should be allowed to rule the Black Belt territory, kicking out the white landlords and government officials? Did I feel that the working class could run the mills and mines and government? That it wasn't necessary to have bosses at all? I told them that I believed all of that and more. Herndon was convicted and spent 5 years in prison until in 1937, the Supreme Court ruled unconstitutional the Georgia statute under which he was found guilty. It was men like him who represented to the establishment a dangerous militancy among blacks, made more dangerous when linked with the Communist Party. There were others who made that same connection, magnifying the danger. Benjamin Davis, the black lawyer who defended Herndon at his trial, nationally renowned men like singer and actor Paul Robeson, and writer and scholar W.E.B. Du Bois, who did not hide their support and sympathy for the Communist Party. The Negro was not as anti-communist as the white population. He could not afford to be. His friends were so few. So that Herndon, Davis, Robeson, Du Bois, however their political views might be maligned by the country as a whole, found admiration for their fighting spirit in the black community. The black militant mood, flashing here and there in the 30s, was reduced to a subsurface simmering during World War II, when the nation on the one hand denounced racism and on the other hand maintained segregation in the armed forces and kept blacks in low-paying jobs. When the war ended, a new element entered the racial balance in the United States: the enormous, unprecedented upsurge of black and yellow people in Africa and Asia. President Harry Truman had to reckon with this, especially as the Cold War rivalry with the Soviet Union began, and the dark-skinned revolt of former colonies all over the world threatened to take Marxist form. Action on the race question was needed, not just to calm a black population at home, emboldened by war promises, frustrated by the basic sameness of their condition. It was needed to present to the world a United States that could counter the continuous communist thrust at the most flagrant failure of American society, the race question. What Du Bois had said long ago, unnoticed, now loomed large in 1945. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. President Harry Truman, in late 1946, appointed a Committee on Civil Rights, which recommended that the Civil Rights section of the Department of Justice be expanded, that there be a permanent commission on civil rights, that Congress pass laws against lynching and to stop voting discrimination, and suggested new laws to end racial discrimination in jobs. Truman's committee was blunt about its motivation in making these recommendations. Yes, it said, there was moral reason, a matter of conscience. But there was also an economic reason. Discrimination was costly to the country, wasteful of its talent. And perhaps most important, there was an international reason. Our position in the post-war world is so vital to the future that our smallest actions have far-reaching effects. We cannot escape the fact that our civil rights record has been an issue in world politics. The world's press and radio are full of it. Those with competing philosophies have stressed and are shamelessly distorting our shortcomings. They have tried to prove our democracy an empty fraud and our nation a consistent oppressor of underprivileged people. This may seem ludicrous to Americans, but it is sufficiently important to worry our friends. The United States is not so strong. The final triumph of the democratic ideal is not so inevitable that we can ignore what the world thinks of us or our record. The United States was out in the world now in a way it had never been. The stakes were large, world supremacy. And as Truman's committee said, our smallest actions have far-reaching effects. And so the United States went ahead to take small actions, hoping they would have large effects. Congress did not move to enact the legislation asked for by the Committee on Civil Rights. But Truman, 4 months before the presidential election of 1948, and challenged from the left in that election by Progressive Party candidate Henry Wallace, issued an executive order asking that the armed forces, segregated in World War II, institute policies of racial equality as rapidly as possible. The order may have been prompted not only by the election, but by the need to maintain black morale in the armed forces as the possibility of war grew. It took over a decade to complete the desegregation in the military. Truman could have issued executive orders in other areas, but did not. The 14th and 15th Amendments, plus the set of laws passed in the late 1860s and early 1870s, gave the president enough authority to wipe out racial discrimination. The Constitution demanded that the president execute the laws. But no president had used that power. Neither did Truman. For instance, he asked Congress for legislation prohibiting discrimination in interstate transportation facilities. But specific legislation in 1887 already barred discrimination in interstate transportation and had never been enforced by executive action. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court was taking steps, 90 years after the Constitution had been amended to establish racial equality, to move toward that end. During the war, it ruled that the white primary, used to exclude blacks from voting in the Democratic Party primaries, which in the South were really the elections, was unconstitutional. In 1954, the court finally struck down the separate but equal doctrine that it had defended since the 1890s. The NAACP brought a series of cases before the court to challenge segregation in the public schools. And now, in Brown v. Board of Education, the court said the separation of school children generates a feeling of inferiority that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely ever to be undone. In the field of public education, it said, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. The court did not insist on immediate change. A year later, it said that segregated facilities should be integrated with all deliberate speed. By 1965, 10 years after the all deliberate speed guideline, more than 75% of the school districts in the South remained segregated. Still, it was a dramatic decision, and the message went around the world in 1954 that the American government had outlawed segregation. In the United States, too, for those not thinking about the customary gap between word and fact, it was an exhilarating sign of change. What to others seemed rapid progress, to blacks was apparently not enough. In the early 1960s, black people rose in rebellion all over the South. And in the late 1960s, they were engaging in wild insurrection in 100 northern cities. It was all a surprise to those without that deep memory of slavery, that everyday presence of humiliation registered in the poetry, the music, the occasional outbursts of anger, the more frequent sullen silences. Part of that memory was of words uttered, laws passed, decisions made, which turned out to be meaningless. For such a people, with such a memory and such daily recapitulation of history, revolt was always minutes away, in a timing mechanism which no one had set, but which might go off with some unpredictable set of events. Those events came at the end of 1955 in the capital city of Alabama, Montgomery. 3 months after her arrest, Mrs. Rosa Parks, a 43-year-old seamstress, explained why she refused to obey the Montgomery law providing for segregation on city buses, why she decided to sit down in the white section of the bus. Well, in the first place, I had been working all day on the job. I was quite tired after spending a full day working. I handle and work on clothing that white people wear. That didn't come in my mind, but this is what I wanted to know. When and how would we ever determine our rights as human beings? It just happened that the driver made a demand, and I just didn't feel like obeying his demand. He called a policeman, and I was arrested and placed in jail. Montgomery blacks called a mass meeting. A powerful force in the community was E.D. Nixon, a veteran trade unionist and experienced organizer. There was a vote to boycott all city buses. Carpools were organized to take Negroes to work. Most people walked. The city retaliated by indicting 100 leaders of the boycott and sent many to jail. White segregationists turned to violence. Bombs exploded in 4 Negro churches. A shotgun blast was fired through the front door of the home of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the 27-year-old Atlanta-born minister who was one of the leaders of the boycott. King's home was bombed. But the black people of Montgomery persisted, and in November 1956, the Supreme Court outlawed segregation on local bus lines. Montgomery was the beginning. It forecast the style and mood of the vast protest movement that would sweep the South in the next 10 years. Emotional church meetings, Christian hymns adapted to current battles, references to lost American ideals, the commitment to nonviolence, the willingness to struggle and sacrifice. A New York Times reporter described a mass meeting in Montgomery during the boycott. One after the other, indicted Negro leaders took the rostrum in a crowded Baptist church tonight to urge their followers to shun the city's buses and walk with God. More than 2,000 Negroes filled the church from basement to balcony and overflowed into the street. They chanted and sang, they shouted and prayed, they collapsed in the aisles, and they sweltered in an 85-degree heat. They pledged themselves again and again to passive resistance. Under this banner, they have carried on for 80 days a stubborn boycott of the city's buses. Martin Luther King, at that meeting, gave a preview of the oratory that would soon inspire millions of people to demand racial justice. He said the protest was not merely over buses, but over things that go deep down into the archives of history. He said, "We have known humiliation. We have known abusive language. We have been plunged into the abyss of oppression. And we decided to raise up only with the weapon of protest. It is one of the greatest glories of America that we have the right of protest. If we are arrested every day, if we are exploited every day, if we are trampled over every day, don't ever let anyone pull you so low as to hate them. We must use the weapon of love. We must have compassion and understanding for those who hate us. We must realize so many people are taught to hate us that they are not totally responsible for their hate. But we stand in life at midnight. We are always on the threshold of a new dawn." King's stress on love and nonviolence was powerfully effective in building a sympathetic following throughout the nation, among whites as well as blacks. But there were blacks who thought the message naive, that while there were misguided people who might be won over by love, there were others who would have to be bitterly fought, and not always with nonviolence. 2 years after the Montgomery boycott in Monroe, North Carolina, an ex-Marine named Robert Williams, the president of the local NAACP, became known for his view that blacks should defend themselves against violence, with guns if necessary. When local Klansmen attacked the home of one of the leaders of the Monroe NAACP, Williams and other blacks, armed with rifles, fired back. The Klan left. The Klan was being challenged now with its own tactic of violence. A Klan raid on an Indian community in North Carolina was repelled by Indians firing rifles. Still, in the years that followed, Southern blacks stressed nonviolence. In February 1st, 1960, 4 freshmen at a Negro college in Greensboro, North Carolina, decided to sit down at the Woolworth's lunch counter downtown where only whites ate. They were refused service, and when they would not leave, the lunch counter was closed for the day. The next day they returned, and then, day after day, other Negroes came to sit silently. In the next 2 weeks, sit-ins spread to 15 cities in 5 southern states. A 17-year-old sophomore at Spelman College in Atlanta, Ruby Doris Smith, heard about Greensboro. When the student committee was formed, I told my older sister to put me on the list, and when 200 students were selected for the first demonstration, I was among them. I went through the food line in the restaurant at the state capitol with 6 other students, but when we got to the cashier, she wouldn't take our money. The lieutenant governor came down and told us to leave. We didn't, and went to the county jail. In his Harlem apartment in New York, a young Negro teacher of mathematics named Bob Moses saw a photo in the newspapers of the Greensboro sit-inners. The students in that picture had a certain look on their faces, sort of sullen, angry, determined. Before, the Negro in the South had always looked on the defensive, cringing. This time, they were taking the initiative. They were kids my age, and I knew this had something to do with my own life. There was violence against the sit-inners, but the idea of taking the initiative against segregation took hold. In the next 12 months, more than 50,000 people, mostly black, some white, participated in demonstrations of one kind or another in 100 cities, and over 3,600 people were put in jail. But by the end of 1960, lunch counters were open to blacks in Greensboro and many other places. A year after the Greensboro incident, a northern-based group dedicated to racial equality, CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, organized freedom rides in which blacks and whites traveled together on buses going through the South to try to break the segregation pattern in interstate travel. Such segregation had long been illegal, but the federal government never enforced the law in the South. The president now was John F. Kennedy, but he too seemed cautious about the race question, concerned about the support of Southern white leaders of the Democratic Party. The 2 buses that left Washington, D.C. on May 4th, 1961, headed for New Orleans, never got there. In South Carolina, rioters were beaten. In Alabama, a bus was set afire. Freedom riders were attacked with fists and iron bars. The Southern police did not interfere with any of this violence, nor did the federal government. FBI agents watched, took notes, did nothing. At this point, veterans of the sit-ins who had recently formed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, dedicated to nonviolent but militant action for equal rights, organized another freedom ride from Nashville to Birmingham. Before they started out, they called the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. to ask for protection. As Ruby Doris Smith reported, the Justice Department said no, they couldn't protect anyone, but if something happened, they would investigate. You know how they do. The racially mixed SNCC freedom riders were arrested in Birmingham, Alabama, spent a night in jail, were taken to the Tennessee border by police, made their way back to Birmingham, took a bus to Montgomery, and there were attacked by whites with fists and clubs in a bloody scene. They resumed their trip to Jackson, Mississippi. By this time, the Freedom Riders were in the news all over the world, and the government was anxious to prevent further violence. Attorney General Robert Kennedy, instead of insisting on their right to travel without being arrested, agreed to the Freedom Riders being arrested in Jackson in return for Mississippi police protection against possible mob violence. As Victor Navasky comments in Kennedy Justice about Robert Kennedy, he didn't hesitate to trade the Freedom Riders' constitutional right to interstate travel for Senator Eastland's guarantee of their right to live. The Freedom Riders did not become subdued in jail. They resisted, protested, sang, demanded their rights. Stokely Carmichael recalled later how he and his fellow inmates were singing in the Parchman jail in Mississippi, and the sheriff threatened to take away their mattresses. I hung on to the mattress and said, "I think we have a right to them, and I think you're unjust." And he said, "I don't want to hear all that shit, nigger," and started to put on the wrist breakers. I wouldn't move and started to sing, "I'm gonna tell God how you treat me," and everybody started singing it. And by this time, Tyson was really to pieces. He called to the trustees, "Get him in there," and he went out the door and slammed it and left everybody else with their mattresses. In Albany, Georgia, a small, deep South town where the atmosphere of slavery still lingered, mass demonstrations took place in the winter of 1961 and again in 1962. Of 22,000 black people in Albany, over 1,000 went to jail for marching, assembling, to protest segregation and discrimination. Here, as in all the demonstrations that would sweep over the South, little black children participated. A new generation was learning to act. The Albany police chief, after one of the mass arrests, was taking the names of prisoners lined up before his desk. He looked up and saw a Negro boy about 9 years old. "What's your name?" The boy looked straight at him and said, "Freedom, freedom." There is no way of measuring the effect of that Southern movement on the sensibilities of a whole generation of young black people, or of tracing the process by which some of them became activists and leaders. In Lee County, Georgia, after the events of 1961 to 1962, a black teenager named James Crawford joined SNCC and began taking black people to the county courthouse to vote. One day, bringing a woman there, he was approached by the deputy registrar. Another SNCC worker took notes on the conversation. "Registrar, what do you want?" "I brought this lady down to register." Registrar, after giving the woman a card to fill out and sending her outside in the hall. "Why did you bring this lady down here?" "Because she wants to be a first-class citizen like y'all." "Well, who are you to bring people down to register?" "It's my job." "Suppose you get 2 bullets in your head right now." "I got to die anyhow." "If I don't do it, I can get somebody else to do it." No reply. "Are you scared?" "No." "Suppose somebody came in that door and shoot you in the back of the head right now, what would you do?" "I couldn't do nothing. If they shoot me in the back of the head, there are people coming from all over the world." "What people?" "The people I work for." In Birmingham in 1963, thousands of blacks went into the streets, facing police clubs, tear gas, dogs, high-powered water hoses. And meanwhile, all over the Deep South, the young people of SNCC, mostly black, a few white, were moving into communities in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas. Joined by local black people, they were organizing to register people to vote, to protest against racism, to build up courage against violence. The Department of Justice recorded 1,412 demonstrations in 3 months of 1963. Imprisonment became commonplace. Beatings became frequent. Many local people were afraid. Others came forward. A 19-year-old black student from Illinois named Carver Neblett, working for SNCC in Terrell County, Georgia, reported, "I talked with a blind man who was extremely interested in the civil rights movement. He has been keeping up with the movement from the beginning. Even though this man is blind, he wants to learn all the questions on the literacy test. Imagine, while many are afraid that white men will burn our houses, shoot into them, or put us off their property, a blind man, 70 years old, wants to come to our meetings." As the summer of 1964 approached, SNCC and other civil rights groups working together in Mississippi and facing increasing violence decided to call upon young people from other parts of the country for help. They hoped that would bring attention to the situation in Mississippi. Again and again in Mississippi and elsewhere, the FBI had stood by. Lawyers for the Justice Department had stood by, while civil rights workers were beaten and jailed, while federal laws were violated. On the eve of the Mississippi summer, in early June 1964, the civil rights movement rented a theater near the White House, and a busload of black Mississippians traveled to Washington to testify publicly about the daily violence, the dangers facing the volunteers coming into Mississippi. Constitutional lawyers testified that the national government had the legal power to give protection against such violence. The transcript of this testimony was given to President Johnson and Attorney General Kennedy, accompanied by a request for a protected federal presence during the Mississippi summer. There was no response. 12 days after the public hearing, 3 civil rights workers, James Chaney, a young black Mississippian, and 2 white volunteers, Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner, were arrested in Philadelphia, Mississippi, released from jail late at night, then seized, beaten with chains, and shot to death. Ultimately, an informer's testimony led to jail sentences for the sheriff and deputy sheriff and others. That came too late. The Mississippi murders had taken place after the repeated refusal of the national government, under Kennedy or Johnson or any other president, to defend blacks against violence. Dissatisfaction with the national government intensified. Later that summer, during the Democratic National Convention in Washington, Mississippi blacks asked to be seated as part of the state delegation to represent the 40% of the state's population who were black. They were turned down by the liberal Democratic leadership, including vice presidential candidate Hubert Humphrey. Congress began reacting to the black revolt, the turmoil, the world publicity. Civil rights laws were passed in 1957, 1960, and 1964. They promised much on voting equality, on employment equality, but were enforced poorly or ignored. In 1965, President Johnson sponsored and Congress passed an even stronger voting rights law, this time ensuring on-the-spot federal protection of the right to register and vote. The effect on Negro voting in the South was dramatic. In 1952, 1 million Southern blacks, 20% of those eligible, registered to vote. In 1964, the number was 2 million, 40%. By 1968, it was 3 million, 60%, the same percentage as white voters. The federal government was trying, without making fundamental changes, to control an explosive situation, to channel anger into the traditional cooling mechanism of the ballot box, the polite petition, the officially endorsed quiet gathering. When black civil rights leaders planned a huge march on Washington in the summer of 1963 to protest the failure of the nation to solve the race problem, it was quickly embraced by President Kennedy and other national leaders and turned into a friendly assemblage. Martin Luther King's speech there thrilled 200,000 black and white Americans. I have a dream. It was magnificent oratory, but without the anger that many blacks felt. When John Lewis, a young Alabama-born SNCC leader, much arrested, much beaten, tried to introduce a stronger note of outrage at the meeting, he was censored by the leaders of the march, who insisted he omit certain sentences critical of the national government and urging militant action. 18 days after the Washington gathering, almost as if in deliberate contempt for its moderation, a bomb exploded in the basement of a black church in Birmingham, and 4 girls attending a Sunday school class were killed. President Kennedy had praised the deep fervor and quiet dignity of the march, but the black militant Malcolm X was probably closer to the mood of the black community. Speaking in Detroit 2 months after the March on Washington and the Birmingham bombing, Malcolm X said in his powerful, icy clear, rhythmic style, "The Negroes were out there in the streets. They were talking about how they were going to march on Washington, that they were going to march on Washington, march on the Senate, march on the White House, march on the Congress, and tie it up, bring it to a halt, not let the government proceed. They even said they were going out to the airport and lay down on the runway and not let any airplanes land. I'm telling you what they said. That was revolution. That was revolution. That was the black revolution. It was the grassroots out there in the street. It scared the white man's death, scared the white power structure in Washington, D.C. to death. I was there. When they found out that this black steamroller was going to come down on the Capitol, they called in these national Negro leaders that you respect and told them, call it off. Kennedy said, look, you all are letting this thing go too far. And old Tom said, boss, I can't stop it because I didn't start it. I'm telling you what they said. They said, I'm not even in it, much less at the head of it. They said, these Negroes are doing things on their own. They're running ahead of us. And that old shrewd fox, he said, if you all aren't in it, I'll put you in it. I'll put you at the head of it. I'll endorse it. I'll welcome it. I'll help it. I'll join it. This is what they did with the March on Washington. They joined it, became part of it, took it over. And as they took it over, it lost its militancy. It ceased to be angry. It ceased to be hot. It ceased to be uncompromising. Why, it even ceased to be a march. It became a picnic, a circus, nothing but a circus with clowns and all. No, it was a sellout. It was a takeover. They controlled it so tight, they told those Negroes what time to hit town, where to stop, what signs to carry, what song to sing, what speech they could make, and what speech they couldn't make, and then told them to get out of town by sundown. The accuracy of Malcolm X's caustic description of the March on Washington is corroborated in the description from the other side, from the establishment, by White House advisor Arthur Schlesinger in his book, 1,000 Days. He tells how Kennedy met with the civil rights leaders and said the march would create an atmosphere of intimidation just when Congress was considering civil rights bills. A. Philip Randolph replied, "The Negroes are already in the streets. It is very likely impossible to get them off." Schlesinger says, "The conference with the president did persuade the civil rights leaders that they should not lay siege to Capitol Hill." Schlesinger describes the Washington March admiringly and then concludes, "So, in 1963, Kennedy moved to incorporate the Negro Revolution into the Democratic coalition." But it did not work. The blacks could not be easily brought into the Democratic coalition when bombs kept exploding in churches, when new civil rights laws did not change the root condition of black people. In the spring of 1963, the rate of unemployment for whites was 4.8%. For non-whites, it was 12.1%. According to government estimates, 1/5 of the white population was below the poverty line, and 1/2 of the black population was below that line. The civil rights bills emphasized voting, but voting was not a fundamental solution to racism or poverty. In Harlem, blacks who had voted for years still lived in rat-infested slums. In precisely those years when civil rights legislation coming out of Congress reached its peak, 1964 and 1965, there were black outbreaks in every part of the country. In Florida, set off by the killing of a Negro woman and a bomb threat against a Negro high school. In Cleveland, set off by the killing of a white minister who sat in the path of a bulldozer to protest discrimination against blacks in construction work. In New York, set off by the fatal shooting of a 15-year-old Negro boy during a fight with an off-duty policeman. There were riots also in Rochester, Jersey City, Chicago, Philadelphia. In August 1965, just as Lyndon Johnson was signing into law the Strong Voting Rights Act, providing for federal registration of black voters to ensure their protection, the black ghetto in Watts, Los Angeles, erupted in the most violent urban outbreak since World War II. It was provoked by the forcible arrest of a young Negro driver, the clubbing of a bystander by police, the seizure of a young black woman falsely accused of spitting on the police. There was rioting in the streets, looting and firebombing of stores. Police and National Guardsmen were called in. They used their guns. 34 people were killed, most of them black. Hundreds injured, 4,000 arrested. Robert Cano, a West Coast journalist, wrote of the riot, "Rivers of blood, years of darkness." In Los Angeles, the Negro was going on record that he would no longer turn the other cheek. That frustrated and goaded, he would strike back, whether the response of violence was an appropriate one or no. In the summer of 1966, there were more outbreaks, with rock throwing, looting, and firebombing by Chicago blacks, and wild shootings by the National Guard. 3 blacks were killed, one a 13-year-old boy, another a 14-year-old pregnant girl. In Cleveland, the National Guard was summoned to stop a commotion in the black community. 4 Negroes were shot to death, 2 by troopers, 2 by white civilians. It seemed clear by now that the nonviolence of the Southern movement, perhaps tactically necessary in the Southern atmosphere, and effective because it could be used to appeal to national opinion against the segregationist South, was not enough to deal with the entrenched problems of poverty in the black ghetto. In 1910, 90% of Negroes lived in the South. But by 1965, mechanical cotton pickers harvested 81% of Mississippi Delta cotton. Between 1940 and 1970, 4 million blacks left the country for the city. By 1965, 80% of blacks lived in cities, and 50% of the black people lived in the North. There was a new mood in SNCC and among many militant blacks. Their disillusionment was expressed by a young black writer, Julius Lester. "Now it is over. America has had chance after chance to show that it really meant that all men are endowed with certain inalienable rights. Now it is over. The days of singing freedom songs and the days of combating bullets and billy clubs with love. Love is fragile and gentle and seeks a like response. They used to sing, 'I love everybody,' as they ducked bricks and bottles. Now they sing, 'Too much love, too much love. Nothing kills a nigger like too much love.'" In 1967, in the black ghettos of the country came the greatest urban riots of American history. According to the report of the National Advisory Committee on Urban Disorders, they involved Negroes acting against local symbols of white American society, symbols of authority and property in the black neighborhoods, rather than purely against white persons. The commission reported 8 major uprisings, 33 serious but not major outbreaks, and 123 minor disorders. 83 died of gunfire, mostly in Newark and Detroit. The overwhelming majority of the persons killed or injured in all the disorders were Negro civilians. The typical rioter, according to the commission, was a young high school dropout, but nevertheless somewhat better educated than his non-rioting Negro neighbor, and usually underemployed or employed in a menial job. He was proud of his race, extremely hostile to both whites and middle-class Negroes, and although informed about politics, highly distrustful of the political system. The report blamed white racism for the disorders and identified the ingredients of the explosive mixture which has been accumulating in our cities since the end of World War II. Pervasive discrimination and segregation in employment, education, and housing, growing concentrations of impoverished Negroes in our major cities, creating a growing crisis of deteriorating facilities and services and unmet human needs. A new mood has sprung up among Negroes, particularly the young, in which self-esteem and enhanced racial pride are replacing apathy and submission to the system. But the commission report itself was a standard device of the system when facing rebellion. Set up an investigating committee, issue a report. The words of the report, however strong, will have a soothing effect. That didn't completely work either. Black Power was the new slogan, an expression of distrust of any progress given or conceded by whites, a rejection of paternalism. Few blacks or whites knew the statement of the white writer Aldous Huxley. Liberties are not given, they are taken. But the idea was there in Black Power. Also, a pride in race, an insistence on black independence, and often on black separation to achieve this independence. Malcolm X was the most eloquent spokesman for this. After he was assassinated as he spoke on a public platform in February 1965, in a plan whose origins are still obscure, he became the martyr of this movement. Hundreds of thousands read his autobiography. He was more influential in death than during his lifetime. Martin Luther King, though still respected, was being replaced now by new heroes. Huey Newton of the Black Panthers, for instance. The Panthers had guns. They said blacks should defend themselves. Malcolm X, in late 1964, had spoken to black students from Mississippi visiting Harlem. You'll get freedom by letting your enemy know that you'll do anything to get your freedom. Then you'll get it. It's the only way you'll get it. When you get that kind of attitude, they'll label you as a crazy Negro, or they'll call you a crazy nigger. They don't say Negro. Or they'll call you an extremist, or a subversive, or a seditious, or a red, or a radical. But when you stay radical long enough and get enough people to be like you, you'll get your freedom. Congress responded to the riots of 1967 by passing the Civil Rights Act of 1968. Presumably, it would make stronger the laws prohibiting violence against blacks. It increased the penalties against those depriving people of their civil rights. However, it said, the provisions of this section shall not apply to acts or omissions on the part of law enforcement officers, members of the National Guard, or members of the Armed Forces of the United States who are engaged in suppressing a riot or a civil disturbance. Furthermore, it added a section, agreed to by liberal members of Congress in order to get the whole bill passed, that provided up to 5 years in prison for anyone traveling interstate or using interstate facilities, including mail and telephone, to organize, promote, encourage, participate in, or carry on a riot. It defined a riot as an action by 3 or more people involving threats of violence. The first person prosecuted under the Civil Rights Act of 1968 was a young black leader of SNCC, H. Rap Brown, who had made a militant, angry speech in Maryland just before a racial disturbance there. Later, the act would be used against anti-war demonstrators in Chicago, the Chicago 8. Martin Luther King himself became more and more concerned about problems untouched by civil rights laws, problems coming out of poverty. In the spring of 1968, he began speaking out against the advice of some Negro leaders who feared losing friends in Washington, against the war in Vietnam. He connected war and poverty. It's inevitable that we've got to bring out the question of the tragic mix-up in priorities. We are spending all of this money for death and destruction, and not nearly enough money for life and constructive development. When the guns of war become a national obsession, social needs inevitably suffer. King now became a chief target of the FBI, which tapped his private phone conversations, sent him fake letters, threatened him, blackmailed him, and even suggested once in an anonymous letter that he commit suicide. FBI internal memos discussed finding a black leader to replace King. As a Senate report on the FBI said in 1976, the FBI tried to destroy Dr. Martin Luther King. King was turning his attention to troublesome questions. He still insisted on nonviolence. Riots were self-defeating, he thought, but they did express a deep feeling that could not be ignored. And so, nonviolence, he said, must be militant, massive nonviolence. He planned a poor people's encampment in Washington, this time not with the paternal approval of the president. And he went to Memphis, Tennessee to support a strike of garbage workers in that city. There, standing on a balcony outside his hotel room, he was shot to death by an unseen marksman. The poor people's encampment went on, and then it was broken up by police action, just as the World War I Veterans Bonus Army of 1932 was dispersed. The killing of King brought new urban outbreaks all over the country, in which 39 people were killed, 35 of them black. Evidence was piling up that even with all of the civil rights laws now on the books, the courts would not protect blacks against violence and injustice. Number 1. In the 1967 riots in Detroit, 3 black teenagers were killed in the Algiers Motel. 3 Detroit policemen and a black private guard were tried for this triple murder. The defense conceded, a UPI dispatch said, that the 4 men had shot 2 of the blacks. A jury exonerated them. Number 2. In Jackson, Mississippi, in the spring of 1970, on the campus of Jackson State College, a Negro college, police laid down a 28-second barrage of gunfire using shotguns, rifles, and a submachine gun. 400 bullets or pieces of buckshot struck the girls' dormitory, and 2 black students were killed. A local grand jury found the attack justified, and U.S. District Court Judge Harold Cox, a Kennedy appointee, declared that students who engage in civil disorders must expect to be injured or killed. Number 3. In Boston in April 1970, a policeman shot and killed an unarmed black man, a patient in a ward in the Boston City Hospital, firing 5 shots after the black man snapped a towel at him. The chief judge of the Municipal Court of Boston exonerated the policeman. Number 4. In Augusta, Georgia, in May 1970, 6 Negroes were shot to death during looting and disorder in the city. The New York Times reported, a confidential police report indicates that at least 5 of the victims were killed by the police. An eyewitness to one of the deaths said he had watched a Negro policeman and his white partner fire 9 shots into the back of a man suspected of looting. They did not fire warning shots or ask him to stop running, said Charles A. Reed, a 38-year-old businessman. Number 5. In April 1970, a federal jury in Boston found the policeman had used excessive force against 2 black soldiers from Fort Devens, and one of them required 12 stitches in his scalp. The judge awarded the serviceman $3 in damages. These were normal cases, endlessly repeated in the history of the country, coming randomly but persistently out of a racism deep in the institutions, the mind of the country. But there was something else, a planned pattern of violence against militant black organizers carried on by the police and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. On December 4th, 1969, a little before 5 in the morning, a squad of Chicago police, armed with a submachine gun and shotguns, raided an apartment where Black Panthers lived. They fired at least 82 and perhaps 200 rounds into the apartment, killing 21-year-old Black Panther leader Fred Hampton as he lay in his bed, and another Black Panther, Mark Clark. Years later, it was discovered in a court proceeding that the FBI had an informer among the Panthers, and that they had given the police a floor plan of the apartment, including a sketch of where Fred Hampton slept. Was the government turning to murder and terror because the concessions, the legislation, the speeches, the intonation of the civil rights hymn, "We Shall Overcome" by President Lyndon Johnson, were not working? It was discovered later that the government, in all the years of the civil rights movement, while making concessions through Congress, was acting through the FBI to harass and break up black militant groups. Between 1956 and 1971, the FBI concluded a massive counterintelligence program known as COINTELPRO that took 295 actions against black groups. Black militancy seemed stubbornly resistant to destruction. A secret FBI report to President Nixon in 1970 said, a recent poll indicates that approximately 25% of the black population has a great respect for the Black Panther Party, including 43% of blacks under 21 years of age. Was there fear that blacks would turn their attention from the controllable field of voting to the more dangerous arena of wealth and poverty, of class conflict? In 1966, 70 poor black people in Greenville, Mississippi, occupied an unused Air Force barracks until they were evicted by the military. A local woman, Mrs. Unita Blackwell, said, I feel that the federal government have proven that it don't care about poor people. Everything that we have asked for through these years have been handed down on paper. It's never been a reality. We, the poor people of Mississippi, is tired. We're tired of it, so we're going to build for ourselves because we don't have a government that represents us. Out of the 1967 riots in Detroit came an organization devoted to organizing black workers for revolutionary change. This was the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, which lasted until 1971 and influenced thousands of black workers in Detroit during its period of activity. The new emphasis was more dangerous than civil rights because it created the possibility of blacks and whites uniting on the issue of class exploitation. Back in November 1963, A. Philip Randolph had spoken to an AFL-CIO convention about the civil rights movement and foreseen its direction. The Negro's protest today is but the first rumbling of the underclass. As the Negro has taken to the streets, so will the unemployed of all races take to the streets. Attempts began to do with blacks what had been done historically with whites, to lure a small number into the system with economic enticements. There was talk of black capitalism. Leaders of the NAACP and CORE were invited to the White House. James Farmer of CORE, a former freedom writer and militant, was given a job in President Nixon's administration. Floyd McKissick of CORE received a $14 million government loan to build a housing development in North Carolina. Lyndon Johnson had given jobs to some blacks through the Office of Economic Opportunity. Nixon set up an Office of Minority Business Enterprise. Chase Manhattan Bank and the Rockefeller family, controllers of Chase, took a special interest in developing black capitalism. The Rockefellers had always been financial patrons of the Urban League and a strong influence in black education through their support of Negro colleges in the South. David Rockefeller tried to persuade his fellow capitalists that while helping black businessmen with money might not be fruitful in the short run, it was necessary to shape an environment in which the business can continue earning a profit 4 or 5 or 10 years from now. With all of this, black business remained infinitesimally small. The largest black corporation, Motown Industries, had sales in 1974 of $45 million, while Exxon Corporation had sales of $42 billion. The total receipts of black-owned firms accounted for 0.3% of all business income. There was a small amount of change and a lot of publicity. There were more black faces in the newspapers and on television, creating an impression of change and siphoning off into the mainstream a small but significant number of black leaders. Some new black voices spoke against this. Robert Allen, Black Awakening in Capitalist America, wrote, "If the community as a whole is to benefit, then the community as a whole must be organized to manage collectively its internal economy and its business relations with white America. Black business firms must be treated and operated as social property belonging to the general black community, not as the private property of individual or limited groups of individuals. This necessitates the dismantling of capitalist property relations in the black community and their replacement with a planned communal economy." A black woman, Patricia Robinson, in a pamphlet distributed in Boston in 1970, Poor Black Woman, tied male supremacy to capitalism and said the black woman allies herself with the have-nots in the wider world and their revolutionary struggles. She said the poor black woman did not in the past question the social and economic system, but now she must, and in fact, she has begun to question aggressive male domination and the class society which enforces it, capitalism. Another black woman, Margaret Wright, said she was not fighting for equality with men if it meant equality in the world of killing, the world of competition. "I don't want to compete on no damned exploitative level. I don't want to exploit nobody. I want the right to be black and me." The system was working hard by the late 60s and early 70s to contain the frightening explosiveness of the black upsurge. Blacks were voting in large numbers in the South, and in the 1968 Democratic Convention, 3 blacks were admitted into the Mississippi delegation. By 1977, more than 2,000 blacks held office in 11 southern states. In 1965, the number was 72. There were 2 congressmen, 11 state senators, 95 state representatives, 267 county commissioners, 76 mayors, 824 city council members, 18 sheriffs or chiefs of police, 508 school board members. It was a dramatic advance. But blacks, with 20% of the South's population, still held less than 3% of the elective offices. A New York Times reporter analyzing the new situation in 1977 pointed out that even where blacks held important city offices, whites almost always retain economic power. After Maynard Jackson, a black, became mayor of Atlanta, the white business establishment continued to exert its influence. Those blacks in the South who could afford to go to downtown restaurants and hotels were no longer barred because of their race. More blacks could go to colleges and universities, to law schools and medical schools. Northern cities were busing children back and forth in an attempt to create racially mixed schools, despite the racial segregation in housing. None of this, however, was halting what Francis Piven and Richard Cloward, poor people's movements, called the destruction of the black lower class, the unemployment, the deterioration of the ghetto, the rising crime, drug addiction, violence. In the summer of 1977, the Department of Labor reported that the rate of unemployment among black youths was 34.8%. A small, new, black middle class of blacks had been created, and it raised the overall statistics for black income. But there was a great disparity between the newly risen middle-class black and the poor left behind. Despite the new opportunities for a small number of blacks, the median black family income of 1977 was only about 60% that of whites. Blacks were twice as likely to die of diabetes, 7 times as likely to be victims of homicidal violence rising out of the poverty and despair of the ghetto. A New York Times report in early 1978 said, "The places that experienced urban riots in the 1960s have, with a few exceptions, changed little, and the conditions of poverty have spread in most cities." Statistics did not tell the whole story. Racism, always a national fact, not just a Southern one, emerged in northern cities as the federal government made concessions to poor blacks in a way that pitted them against poor whites for resources made scarce by the system. Blacks, freed from slavery to take their place under capitalism, had long been forced into conflict with whites for scarce jobs. Now, with desegregation in housing, blacks tried to move into neighborhoods where whites themselves poor, crowded, troubled, could find in them a target for their anger. In the Boston Globe, November 1977, a Hispanic family of 6 fled their apartment in the Savin Hill section of Dorchester yesterday after a week of repeated stonings and window smashings by a group of white youths in what appears to have been racially motivated attacks, police say. In Boston, the busing of black children to white schools and whites to black schools set off a wave of white neighborhood violence. The use of busing to integrate schools, sponsored by the government and the courts in response to the black movement, was an ingenious concession to protest. It had the effect of pushing poor whites and poor blacks into competition for the miserable, inadequate schools which the system provided for all the poor. Was the black population, hemmed into the ghetto, divided by the growth of a middle class, decimated by poverty, attacked by the government, driven into conflict with whites, under control? Surely in the mid-70s there was no great black movement underway. Yet a new black consciousness had been born and was still alive. Also, whites and blacks were crossing racial lines in the South to unite as a class against employers. In 1971, 2,000 woodworkers in Mississippi, black and white, joined together to protest a new method of measuring wood that led to lower wages. In the textile mills of J.P. Stevens, where 44,000 workers were employed in 85 plants, mostly in the South, blacks and whites were working together in union activity. In Tifton, Georgia, and Milledgeville, Georgia, in 1977, blacks and whites served together on the union committees of their plants. Would a new black movement go beyond the limits of the civil rights actions of the 60s, beyond the spontaneous urban riots of the 70s, beyond separatism to a coalition of white and black in a historic new alliance? There was no way of knowing this in 1978. In 1978, 6 million black people were unemployed. As Langston Hughes said, "What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up, or does it explode?" If it did explode, as it had in the past, it would come with a certain inevitability, out of the conditions of black life in America. And yet, because no one knew when, it would come as a surprise. Chapter 18, The Impossible Victory, Vietnam. From 1964 to 1972, the wealthiest and most powerful nation in the history of the world made a maximum military effort, with everything short of atomic bombs, to defeat a nationalist revolutionary movement in a tiny peasant country, and failed. When the United States fought in Vietnam, it was organized modern technology versus organized human beings, and the human beings won. In the course of that war, there developed in the United States the greatest anti-war movement the nation had ever experienced, a movement that played a critical part in bringing the war to an end. It was another startling fact of the 60s. In the fall of 1945, Japan, defeated, was forced to leave Indochina, the former French colony it had occupied at the start of the war. In the meantime, a revolutionary movement had grown there, determined to end colonial control and to achieve a new life for the peasants of Indochina. Led by a communist named Ho Chi Minh, the revolutionists fought against the Japanese, and when they were gone, held a spectacular celebration in Hanoi in late 1945, with 1 million people in the streets, and issued a Declaration of Independence. It borrowed from the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen in the French Revolution, and from the American Declaration of Independence, and began, "All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Just as the Americans in 1776 had listed their grievances against the English king, the Vietnamese listed their complaints against French rule. They have enforced inhuman laws. They have built more prisons than schools. They have mercilessly slain our patriots. They have drowned uprisings in rivers of blood. They have fettered public opinion. They have robbed us of our rice fields, our mines, our forests, and our raw materials. They have invented numerous unjustifiable taxes and reduced our people, especially our peasantry, to a state of extreme poverty. From the end of last year to the beginning of this year, more than 2 million of our fellow citizens died of starvation. The whole Vietnamese people, animated by a common purpose, are determined to fight to the bitter end against any attempt by the French colonialists to reconquer their country. The U.S. Defense Department's study of the Vietnam War, intended to be top secret, but released to the public by Daniel Ellsberg and Anthony Russo in the famous Pentagon Papers case, described Ho Chi Minh's work. Ho had built the Viet Minh into the only Vietnam-wide political organization capable of effective resistance to either the Japanese or the French. He was the only Vietnamese wartime leader with a national following, and he assured himself wider fealty among the Vietnamese people when in August and September 1945, he overthrew the Japanese, established the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and staged receptions for incoming Allied occupation forces. For a few weeks in September 1945, Vietnam was, for the first and only time in its modern history, free of foreign domination and united from north to south under Ho Chi Minh. The Western powers were already at work to change this. England occupied the southern part of Indochina and then turned it back to the French. Nationalist China, this was under Chiang Kai-shek before the Communist Revolution, occupied the northern part of Indochina, and the United States persuaded it to turn that back to the French. As Ho Chi Minh told an American journalist, "We apparently stand quite alone. We shall have to depend on ourselves." Between October 1945 and February 1946, Ho Chi Minh wrote 8 letters to President Truman, reminding him of the self-determination promises of the Atlantic Charter. One of the letters was sent both to Truman and to the United Nations. "I wish to invite attention of Your Excellency for strictly humanitarian reasons to following matter. 2 million Vietnamese died of starvation during winter of 1944 and spring 1945 because of starvation policy of French, who seized and stored until it rotted all available rice. 3/4 of cultivated land was flooded in the summer of 1945, which was followed by a severe drought. Of normal harvest, 5/6 was lost. Many people are starving. Unless great world powers and international relief organizations bring us immediate assistance, we face imminent catastrophe." Truman never replied. In October of 1946, the French bombarded Haiphong, a port in northern Vietnam, and there began the 8-year war between the Viet Minh movement and the French over who would rule Vietnam. After the communist victory in China in 1949 and the Korean War the following year, the United States began giving large amounts of military aid to the French. By 1954, the United States had given 300,000 small arms and machine guns, enough to equip the entire French army in Indochina, and $1 billion. Altogether, the U.S. was financing 80% of the French war effort. Why was the United States doing this? To the public, the word was that the United States was helping to stop communism in Asia. But there was not much public discussion. In the secret memoranda of the National Security Council, which advised the president on foreign policy, there was talk in 1950 of what came to be known as the domino theory, that like a row of dominoes, if one country fell to communism, the next one would do the same, and so on. It was important, therefore, to keep the first one from falling. A secret memo of the National Security Council in June 1952 also pointed to the chain of U.S. military bases along the coast of China, the Philippines, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea. Communist control of all of Southeast Asia would render the U.S. position in the Pacific offshore island chain precarious and would seriously jeopardize fundamental U.S. security interests in the Far East. And Southeast Asia, especially Malaya and Indonesia, is the principal world source of natural rubber and tin, and a producer of petroleum and other strategically important commodities. It was also noted that Japan depended on the rice of Southeast Asia, and communist victory there would make it extremely difficult to prevent Japan's eventual accommodation to communism. In 1953, a congressional study mission reported, "The area of Indochina is immensely wealthy in rice, rubber, coal, and iron ore. Its position makes it a strategic key to the rest of Southeast Asia." That year, a State Department memorandum said that the French were losing the war in Indochina, had failed to win a sufficient native support, feared that a negotiated settlement would mean the eventual loss to communism not only of Indochina, but of the whole of Southeast Asia, and concluded, if the French actually decided to withdraw, the U.S. would have to consider most seriously whether to take over in this area. In 1954, the French, having been unable to win Vietnamese popular support, which was overwhelmingly behind Ho Chi Minh and the revolutionary movement, had to withdraw. An international assemblage at Geneva presided over the peace agreement between the French and the Viet Minh. It was agreed that the French would temporarily withdraw into the southern part of Vietnam, that the Viet Minh would remain in the north, and that an election would take place in 2 years in a unified Vietnam to enable the Vietnamese to choose their own government. The United States moved quickly to prevent the unification and to establish South Vietnam as an American sphere. It set up in Saigon, as head of the government, a former Vietnamese official named Ngo Dinh Diem, who had recently been living in New Jersey, and encouraged him not to hold the scheduled elections for unification. A memo in early 1954 of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said that intelligence estimates showed a settlement based on free elections would be attended by almost certain loss of the associated states, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, the 3 parts of Indochina created by the Geneva Conference, to communist control. Diem again and again blocked the elections requested by the Viet Minh, and with American money and arms, his government became more and more firmly established. As the Pentagon Papers put it, South Vietnam was essentially the creation of the United States. The Diem regime became increasingly unpopular. Diem was a Catholic, and most Vietnamese were Buddhists. Diem was close to the landlords, and this was a country of peasants. His pretenses at land reform left things basically as they were. He replaced locally selected provincial chiefs with his own men, appointed in Saigon. By 1962, 88% of these provincial chiefs were military men. Diem imprisoned more and more Vietnamese who criticized the regime for corruption, for lack of reform. Opposition grew quickly in the countryside, where Diem's apparatus could not reach well, and around 1958, guerrilla activities began against the regime. The communist regime in Hanoi gave aid, encouragement, and sent people south, most of them Southerners who had gone north after the Geneva Accords, to support the guerrilla movement. In 1960, the National Liberation Front was formed in the South. It united the various strands of opposition to the regime. Its strength came from South Vietnamese peasants, who saw it as a way of changing their daily lives. A U.S. government analyst named Douglas Pike, in his book, Viet Cong, based on interviews with rebels and captured documents, tried to give a realistic assessment of what the United States faced. In the 2,561 villages of South Vietnam, the National Liberation Front created a host of nationwide socio-political organizations in a country where mass organizations were virtually non-existent. Aside from the NLF, there had never been a truly mass-based political party in South Vietnam. Pike wrote, The communists have brought to the villages of South Vietnam significant social change and have done so largely by means of the communication process. That is, they were organizers much more than they were warriors. What struck me most forcibly about the NLF was its totality as a social revolution first and as a war second. Pike was impressed with the mass involvement of the peasants in the movement. The rural Vietnamese was not regarded simply as a pawn in a power struggle, but as the active element in the thrust. He was the thrust. Pike wrote, "The purpose of this vast organizational effort was to restructure the social order of the village and train the villages to control themselves. This was the NLF's one undeviating thrust from the start. Not the killing of Arvin, Saigon, soldiers, not the occupation of real estate, not the preparation for some great pitched battle, but organization in depth of the rural population through the instrument of self-control." Pike estimated that the NLF membership by early 1962 stood at around 300,000. The Pentagon Papers said of this period, "Only the Viet Cong had any real support and influence on a broad base in the countryside." When Kennedy took office in early 1961, he continued the policies of Truman and Eisenhower in Southeast Asia. Almost immediately, he approved a secret plan for various military actions in Vietnam and Laos, including the dispatch of agents to North Vietnam to engage in sabotage and light harassment, according to the Pentagon Papers. Back in 1956, he had spoken of the amazing success of President Diem and said of Diem's Vietnam, "Her political liberty is an inspiration." One day in June 1963, a Buddhist monk sat down in the public square in Saigon and set himself afire. More Buddhist monks began committing suicide by fire to dramatize their opposition to the Diem regime. Diem's police raided the Buddhist pagodas and temples, wounded 30 monks, arrested 1,400 people, and closed down the pagodas. There were demonstrations in the city. The police fired, killing 9 people. Then, in Hue, the ancient capital, 10,000 demonstrated in protest. Under the Geneva Accords, the United States was permitted to have 685 military advisors in southern Vietnam. Eisenhower secretly sent several thousand. Under Kennedy, the figure rose to 16,000, and some of them began to take part in combat operations. Diem was losing. Most of the South Vietnam countryside was now controlled by local villagers organized by the NLF. Diem was becoming an embarrassment, an obstacle to effective control over Vietnam. Some Vietnamese generals began plotting to overthrow his regime, staying in touch with a CIA man named Lucien Conein. Conein met secretly with American Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge, who was enthusiastically for the coup. Lodge reported to Kennedy's assistant, McGeorge Bundy, on October 25th, Pentagon Papers. "I have personally approved each meeting between General Tran Van Don and Conein, who has carried out my orders in each instance explicitly." Kennedy seemed hesitant, but no move was made to warn Diem. Indeed, just before the coup, and just after he had been in touch through Conein with the plotters, Lodge spent a weekend with Diem at a seaside resort. When on November 1st, 1963, the generals attacked the presidential palace, Diem phoned Ambassador Lodge, and the conversation went as follows. Diem: "Some units have made a rebellion, and I want to know what is the attitude of the United States." Lodge: "I do not feel well enough informed to be able to tell you. I have heard the shooting, but am not acquainted with all of the facts. Also, it is 4:30 a.m. in Washington, and the U.S. government cannot possibly have a view." Diem: "But you must have some general ideas." Lodge told Diem to phone him if he could do anything for his physical safety. That was the last conversation any American had with Diem. He fled the palace, but he and his brother were apprehended by the plotters, taken out in a truck, and executed. Earlier in 1963, Kennedy's Undersecretary of State, U. Alexis Johnson, was speaking before the Economic Club of Detroit. What is the attraction that Southeast Asia has exerted for centuries on the great powers flanking it on all sides? Why is it desirable and why is it important? First, it provides a lush climate, fertile soil, rich natural resources, a relatively sparse population in most areas, and room to expand. The countries of Southeast Asia produce rich exportable surpluses such as rice, rubber, teak, corn, tin, spices, oil, and many others. This is not the language that was used by President Kennedy in his explanations to the American public. He talked of communism and freedom. In a news conference February 14, 1962, he said, "Yes, as you know, the U.S. for more than a decade has been assisting the government, the people of Vietnam, to maintain their independence." 3 weeks after the execution of Diem, Kennedy himself was assassinated, and his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, took office. The generals who succeeded Diem could not suppress the National Liberation Front. Again and again, American leaders expressed their bewilderment at the popularity of the NLF, at the high morale of its soldiers. The Pentagon historians wrote that when Eisenhower met with President-elect Kennedy in January 1961, he wondered aloud why in interventions of this kind, we always seemed to find that the morale of the communist forces was better than that of the democratic forces. And General Maxwell Taylor reported in late 1964, "The ability of the Viet Cong continuously to rebuild their units and to make good their losses is one of the mysteries of the guerrilla war. Not only do the Viet Cong units have the recuperative powers of the Phoenix, but they have an amazing ability to maintain morale. Only in rare cases have we found evidence of bad morale among Viet Cong prisoners or recorded in captured Viet Cong documents." In early 1964, President Johnson used a murky set of events in the Gulf of Tonkin, off the coast of North Vietnam, to launch full-scale war on Vietnam. Johnson and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara told the American public there was an attack by North Vietnamese torpedo boats on American destroyers. "While on routine patrol in international waters," McNamara said, "the U.S. destroyer Maddox underwent an unprovoked attack." It later turned out that the Gulf of Tonkin episode was a fake, that the highest American officials had lied to the public, just as they had in the invasion of Cuba under Kennedy. In fact, the CIA had engaged in a secret operation attacking North Vietnamese coastal installations. So if there had been an attack, it would not have been unprovoked. It was not a routine patrol because the Maddox was on a special electronic spying mission. And it was not in international waters, but in Vietnamese territorial waters. It turned out that no torpedoes were fired at the Maddox, as McNamara said. Another reported attack on another destroyer 2 nights later, which Johnson called open aggression on the high seas, seems also to have been an invention. At the time of the incident, Secretary of State Rusk was questioned on NBC television. Reporter: "What explanation, then, can you come up with for this unprovoked attack?" Rusk: "Well, I haven't been able, quite frankly, to come to a fully satisfactory explanation. There is a great gulf of understanding between that world and our world, ideological in character. They see what we think of as the real world in wholly different terms. Their very processes of logic are different, so that it's very difficult to enter into each other's minds across that great ideological gulf." The Tonkin attack brought a congressional resolution passed unanimously in the House and with only 2 dissenting votes in the Senate, giving Johnson the power to take military action as he saw fit in Southeast Asia. 2 months before the Gulf of Tonkin incident, U.S. government leaders met in Honolulu and discussed such a resolution. Rusk said in this meeting, according to the Pentagon Papers, that public opinion on our Southeast Asia policy was badly divided in the United States at the moment, and that therefore the president needed an affirmation of support. The Tonkin resolution gave the president the power to initiate hostilities without the declaration of war by Congress that the Constitution required. The Supreme Court, supposed to be the watchdog of the Constitution, was asked by a number of petitioners in the course of the Vietnam War to declare the war unconstitutional. Again and again, it refused even to consider the issue. Immediately after the Tonkin Affair, American warplanes began bombarding North Vietnam. During 1965, over 200,000 American soldiers were sent to South Vietnam, and in 1966, 200,000 more. By early 1968, there were more than 500,000 American troops there, and the U.S. Air Force was dropping bombs at a rate unequaled in history. Tiny glimmerings of the massive human suffering under this bombardment came to the outside world. On June 5, 1965, the New York Times carried a dispatch from Saigon. As the communists withdrew from Quang Ngai last Monday, United States jet bombers pounded the hills into which they were headed. Many Vietnamese, one estimate is as high as 500, were killed by the strikes. The American contention is that they were Viet Cong soldiers, but 3 out of 4 patients seeking treatment in a Vietnamese hospital afterward for burns from napalm or jellied gasoline were village women. On September 6th, another press dispatch from Saigon. In Bien Ho province south of Saigon on August 15th, United States aircraft accidentally bombed a Buddhist pagoda and a Catholic church. It was the 3rd time their pagoda had been bombed in 1965. A temple of the Chao Dai religious sect in the same area had been bombed twice this year. In another Delta province, there is a woman who has both arms burned off by napalm, and her eyelids so badly burned that she cannot close them. When it is time for her to sleep, her family puts a blanket over her head. The woman had 2 of her children killed in the airstrike that maimed her. Few Americans appreciate what their nation is doing to South Vietnam with air power. Innocent civilians are dying every day in South Vietnam. Large areas of South Vietnam were declared free fire zones, which meant that all persons remaining within them, civilians, old people, children, were considered an enemy, and bombs were dropped at will. Villages suspected of harboring Viet Cong were subject to search and destroy missions. Men of military age in the villages were killed. The homes were burned. The women, children, and old people were sent off to refugee camps. Jonathan Schell, in his book, The Village of Ben Suc, describes such an operation. A village surrounded, attacked, a man riding on a bicycle shot down, 3 people picnicking by the river shot to death, the houses destroyed, the women, children, old people herded together, taken away from their ancestral homes. The CIA in Vietnam, in a program called Operation Phoenix, secretly, without trial, executed at least 20,000 civilians in South Vietnam who were suspected of being members of the Communist underground. A pro-administration analyst wrote in the journal Foreign Affairs in January 1975. Although the Phoenix program did undoubtedly kill or incarcerate many innocent civilians, it did also eliminate many members of the communist infrastructure. After the war, the release of records of the International Red Cross showed that in South Vietnamese prison camps, where at the height of the war 65,000 to 70,000 people were held and often beaten and tortured, American advisors observed and sometimes participated. The Red Cross observers found continuing systematic brutality at the 2 principal Vietnamese POW camps, at Phu Quoc, at Qui Nom, where American advisors were stationed. By the end of the Vietnam War, 7 million tons of bombs had been dropped on Vietnam, more than twice the total bombs dropped on Europe and Asia in World War II, and almost 1 500-pound bomb for every human being in Vietnam. It was estimated that there were 20 million bomb craters in the country. In addition, poisonous sprays were dropped by planes to destroy trees and any kind of growth. An area the size of the state of Massachusetts was covered with such poison. Vietnamese mothers reported birth defects in their children. Yale biologists, using the same poison, 2,4,5-T, on mice, reported defective mice born and said they had no reason to believe the effect on humans was different. On March 16, 1968, a company of American soldiers went into the hamlet of My Lai 4 in Quang Ngai province. They rounded up the inhabitants, including old people and women with infants in their arms. These people were ordered into a ditch where they were methodically shot to death by American soldiers. The testimony of James Dursey, a rifleman, at the later trial of Lieutenant William Calley was reported in the New York Times. Lieutenant Calley and a weeping rifleman named Paul D. Meadlow, the same soldier who had fed candy to the children before shooting them, pushed the prisoners into the ditch. There was an order to shoot by Lieutenant Calley. I can't remember the exact words. It was something like, "Start firing." Meadlow turned to me and said, "Shoot, why don't you shoot?" He was crying. I said, "I can't, I won't." Then Lieutenant Calley and Meadlow pointed their rifles into the ditch and fired. People were diving on top of each other. Mothers were trying to protect their children. Journalist Seymour Hersh, in his book My Lai 4, writes, when Army investigators reached the Barren area in November 1969, in connection with the My Lai probe in the United States, they found mass graves at 3 sites, as well as a ditch full of bodies. It was estimated that between 450 and 500 people, most of them women, children, and old men, had been slain and buried there. The Army tried to cover up what happened, but a letter began circulating from a GI named Ron Riddenhauer, who had heard about the massacre. There were photos taken of the killing by an Army photographer, Ronald Haberl. Seymour Hersh, then working for an anti-war news agency in Southeast Asia called Dispatch News Service, wrote about it. The story of the massacre had appeared in May 1968 in 2 French publications, one called Sud Vietnam en lutte, and another published by the North Vietnamese delegation to the peace talks in Paris. But the American press did not pay any attention. Several of the officers in the My Lai massacre were put on trial, but only Lieutenant William Calley was found guilty. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, but his sentence was reduced twice. He served 3 years. Nixon ordered that he